Hello, welcome to MVP Days. A very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time zone that you're tuning in from. My name is Jayanth. I'm the Senior Principal Engineer at the Product Technology team at Dell EMC. So today we're going to be talking about the Azure Stack deployment. So most of you may be familiar with deploying Azure Stack on an ASDK, which is typically on a single node. Whereas deploying Azure Stack on a fully integrated system, which involves a minimum of 4 nodes and can scale up all the way until 16 nodes, may involve various considerations. So these considerations can be network consideration, or it could be a facility consideration where the Azure Stack integrated rack will be moved into the data center. When I talk about facility consideration, we'll be looking at the power, cooling, the space, and so on and so forth. And we're also going to be looking at connectivity considerations, right? So typically, how do you want to deploy your Azure Stack, whether it's going to be in a connected mode or a disconnected mode. So during this, it may involve a number of stakeholders. Stakeholders may vary from Microsoft to hardware web partners like Dell EMC, or it could involve various department heads within the customer's organization as well. So since it involves many stakeholders at various stages of the deployment, it is critical that we understand what are the outcomes in each of these phases before we look at the deployment of the Azure Stack itself. So moving on, that's a quick introduction about me. So as part of the product technology team at Dell EMC, we play a number of roles. We provide engineering level support to sales, pre-sales, and customers on any new Azure Stack opportunities in the region. We also bridge the gap between the technical and the business transformation use cases for C-level execs. We conduct ongoing deep technical enablement workshops for sales, pre-sales, and also to our partners. Our mission or goal is to establish Dell EMC as a thought leader through community reach out. So we reach out to the community through blogging, speaking, and doing the technical demos as well. So feel free to reach out to me on my social media, either at Twitter or at LinkedIn. Last but not the least, we partner with Dell EMC Engineering, and we conduct an early proof of concepts for any new features that we feel would be a game changer. As part of the agenda, we're going to be looking at the various deployment phases, right from pre-sales discussions all the way until a customer handoff. And what are the various deployment prerequisites to be met? Number of decisions that needs to be made before the deployment can happen. So we're going to be looking at what are those various decisions that both customer and the hardware partner needs to make. And working sessions with the customer. So working session may involve facilities considerations or network consideration, or even the Azure Stack software consideration. So we will see what are those working sessions just to kind of educate the customer before the deployment can begin. And during the delivery phase, we will see, we're going to be talking about facility readiness or network readiness or deployment readiness. So the last activity is typically the deployment activity that is done by the hardware partner. So we will look at what are the various roles and responsibilities of the hardware partner during the deployment phase as well. So let's look at what are the various phases during the deployment of the Azure Stack integrated system. Starting from the planning phase, and let's at a high level look at what are the deliverables from each of these phases. From the planning phase is when the pre-sales discussion will happen with the customer, and the deal qualification is done. So we're going to look at the deal qualification questionnaire from Microsoft. And also the capacity planning, to how to use the capacity planner to arrive at what is the right capacity for the customer. And once they've decided that, they sign a sales contract with the hardware partner, and the software licenses are delivered from the hardware partner to the customer, and the order process is initiated. And during the customer data requirement phase, they actually go through the the deployment worksheet exercise, where the customer needs to fill in all the important data regarding the network, the facilities, the Azure Stack software itself, and all that information. So we're going to look at that in the subsequent section. But so deployment worksheet is actually a deliverable as part of the customer data requirement phase. And also in terms of facilities and network, the Azure Stack software deployment data, all this is captured during this phase. And as part of the factory process, in fact, the factory process begins the moment the customer signs the sales contract. The factory starts to, begins to prepare the hardware, and generally takes between 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the deliverable capabilities of each hardware vendor. And during the delivery phase is when the unpacking of the shipment is done and moved to the designated location within the customer's data center. They need to provide the power, cooling as per what has been agreed on during the planning phase, and the basic hardware check is performed by the hardware partner. And finally, during the deployment phase is when the initial power up, bring up process is done, followed by the HLH configuration. HLH is nothing but the hardware lifecycle host, which we're going to discuss more about in the subsequent section. Post the HLH configuration, the Azure Stack software deployment is performed. Okay, so let's look at what are the various deployment prerequisites to be met before a deployment can begin. So the first one is the deal qualification. Microsoft recently released a deal qualification questionnaire, which has a bunch of questions which evaluate whether a customer's whether Azure Stack is a right fit for the customer or not. So let's look at the deal qualification questionnaire. So there are a number of questions this document has. I'm not going to obviously go through each one of them, but let's look at the important ones. Understand the customer type. Is the customer going to operate Azure Stack, or the Azure Stack is going to be operated by a service provider like a CSP? Is something that we need to understand. And understand the reason why customer would want to adopt Azure Stack, right? It could be due to regulatory compliance, just to meet the regulatory compliance. This is one of the biggest reasons why we see a lot of customers want to move into Azure Stack. Or it could be due to connectivity to the public Azure, poor connectivity to public Azure leading to latency issues. Or customer wants to modernize their IT operations or selected apps. It could be due to app modernization strategy in their organization. The fourth one, this is where we are seeing a lot of customers are showing interest, is to simply move their Windows Server 2008 and SQL Server 2008 to Azure Stack. The reason here is because they want to really take advantage of the Microsoft's offer of 3 years free extension and support if they move into either public Azure or Azure Stack. And determine what this Azure Stack is going to be used for. Right, so typically it could be for IaaS modernization, it could be developing a hybrid application, or implementing Azure solutions where public Azure is not accessible, like we discussed in the previous point, right? Or to simply move into building a cloud-native applications as well. So it's important to engage the Microsoft GBPs, the regional GBPs for every deal qualification. So this is a recommendation for Microsoft. And it's very, very important to be clear on the Azure Stack limitations, right? Today, Azure Stack can support up to 700 VMs, irrespective of the size. It could be 4 or 16. Right? The maximum number of VMs that's supported is 700. Remember, 700 also includes the infrastructure VMs. and the Azure services availability. Azure services, Azure Stack services are a subset of what's available today in public Azure. So it's important to be aware of whether these services are going to be available in Azure Stack or not before making a choice to move into Azure Stack. And obviously there is no BCDR capability natively built into Azure Stack. This is something that the customer needs to explore by working with the third-party solutions. Right. So these are some of the questions that we really want to kind of focus on before making a decision about Azure Stack is actually the right fit for the customer or not. Right. So moving on, capacity planning. So once we have decided that Azure Stack is going to be the right fit for the customer, we need to understand what is the capacity, what kind of, how many scale units are required. The scale units can range from 4 all the way until 16, depending on the customer's requirement, depending on the customer's workload. So Microsoft has a capacity planning worksheet, which obviously has been customized by the hardware vendor. So let's look at what the capacity planning looks like and how do we do a capacity. So here is the capacity planner. This is a Dell EMC capacity planner. So let's look at, so before we begin, I usually reset the node count and reset the form so that we begin from a clean slate. All right, so let's say for example, customer wants to have about 10 basic underscore A3 size VMs. The moment you input this number, you can see automatically it starts evaluating what is the right SKU or what is the right configuration that fits this kind of a workload. As you can see, the consumption of the memory or the CPU has gone up, and you will see these bar graphs fluctuating as we start putting in more numbers on the quantity here. Okay, so let's increase 10 to 100. And you will instantly see that 2 SKUs are completely ruled out because they cannot support this kind of a workload. The only SKUs that are available is 2, 3, and 5. So likewise, hardware partner works with the customer to understand what is the right fit for the customer requirement, and they will come work it out on the workload, typical workload here on the capacity planner, and come up with their recommendations. All right, so moving on from the capacity planning, once the right capacity has been chosen, they also need to choose the right identity provider. The identity provider can be an Azure AD or ADFS. So depending on what the customer can choose, they can go with either Azure AD or ADFS. Licensing model, are they going to go with a capacity-based licensing model or a consumption-based? This is something that they need to make that decision beforehand as well. Not only that, customer also needs to make a decision on how they want to, whether they want a connected mode or in a disconnected mode. Azure Stack can be deployed today in a connected mode or a disconnected mode. Some customers really want to operate in a disconnected mode, something like a dark side. This is connectivity to public Azure. Now, connectivity to public Azure can be through outbound NAT, site-to-site VPN, or through express route. So, if it is express route, they also need to work with the service provider who can offer them express route service. Azure Stack monitoring. So, Azure Stack can natively monitor the software piece of it from the portal itself. There are basically 2 pieces to it. One is the Azure Stack software monitoring and the hardware monitoring. Hardware monitoring is typically offered by the hardware vendor. So hardware monitoring can generally include the compute nodes, the switches. So they may have their own monitoring tools to kind of leverage on. But a customer may already be using something like a centralized monitoring solution. In that case, all these monitoring alerts may need to be forwarded to that centralized monitoring solution as well. So we need to kind of understand how they want to monitor the solution, either from a centralized location or confined to the Azure Stack. Backup and DR discussions, this is something that really needs to happen. So when we talk about backup, there are two types of backup. One is the infrastructure backup and the other one is the tenant backup. But the infrastructure backup is typically the Azure Stack infrastructure backup, which includes the the certificates, the Azure Stack certificates, plans, offers and subscriptions, and RBAC policies, or it could be keyword secrets. Right, so these are the infrastructure backup components. When we're talking about the tenant backup, so by the way, infrastructure backup is natively supported by Azure Stack. When it comes to tenant workload, this is something Azure Stack does not support, which means the tenant or the customer who's consuming the Azure Stack resources or their VMs is responsible for backing up the data for their tenant workloads, right? It really depends on the RTO and the RPO guidelines, even for disaster recovery solutions. So in this case, they can work with the third-party vendors to kind of come up with the various applications like Carbonite or Zero Down. These are just some of the applications that are out there, in the market, who can actually help to build a complete DR story depending on the RTO and RPO guidelines from the customer. Alright, so let's do a quick recap on what we discussed so far. We discussed about the various deployment phases. We discussed about what are the various deployment prerequisites to be met to ensure a smooth deployment. So once these things are through, then customer signs the contract with sales contract with the hardware partner. Hardware partner then in turn kicks off the factory integration process. Now this can take anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks. During this time, customer and the hardware partner enters the data gathering phase. And during the data gathering phase, they gather information about facilities, they gather information about the networking, they gather information about the Azure Stack software deployment piece as well. And the program managers from the hardware partner reviews the education that was provided to the customer during the pre-sales discussions. They also validate their understanding of key concepts for key decision making. The PMs also ensure the SMEs from both parties are participating during these discussions. And then prepares the customer to correctly execute their tasks to make sure that the overall deployment is a success. So let's see what are the data that they gather during the facilities considerations. In the facilities considerations, they talk about delivery, access to the location, the dimension of the integrated rack, whether it's in a position to be accommodated. They talk about the environmental requirements, which includes power, weight, and thermals, whether they have enough cooling that was required for the Azure Stack, whether the data center is able to meet that cooling requirements, and also the power, connectivity to the power. So whether they have access to the power connectors to the rack, where the rack is going to be eventually placed. They also have discussions about network connectivity. When I say network connectivity, it's actually the connectivity from the border to the Azure Stack top of rack switches. So we need to ensure that you have the length of the cables that are able to reach the Azure Stack integrated rack from the border switches and the transceivers. Now the transceivers are basically, they're modules which actually connect the top of rack switches to the customer border switches. Now, the hardware partners, it's hardware partners' responsibility to provide the transceivers on the top of rack switches side. But however, the cables and the transceivers on the border switches needs to be provided by the customer. And they also gather data about the data center access, the hours of operation from the customer, what are the various safety regulations to be met, the security aspects, and other considerations regarding the data center access. So during the network considerations, a number of parameters and a number of data is gathered during this phase, during the network discussions that happen. Azure Stack network IP assignments, or internet communication considerations, typically if they're going with a connected model. So if it's a disconnected model, internet communication considerations may not be valid. And the routing protocol, so this is a routing protocol on the border switches, whether they are going to go with BGP routing or a static routing. So Microsoft recommends BGP routing. So if the customer wants to go with static routing, the hardware partner needs to understand and the proper justification behind that, and the various firewall configurations as well. So during the Azure Stack Software considerations, generally the hardware partner collects data about the identity store the customer wants to go with, whether it's ADFS or Azure AD. If it's a CSP kind of a deployment, whether it's going to be a single tenant or a multi-tenant, and the billing model that they're going to use, is it going to be a capacity based or a consumption based? Please note that consumption based can be used only for a connected deployment. So for a disconnected deployment, the only option for a billing model is a capacity based. And the Azure subscriptions as well. So whether it's an enterprise agreement or a CSP based agreement, depending on what the customer choices are, and the various certificates. So the hardware partner works hand in hand with the customer to ensure they have all the certificates in place before the deployment actually can begin. Okay, so once the shipment arrives in the customer location, it will be unpacked and inspected in the presence of the hardware vendor. And customer takes the responsibility of moving the rack into the final resting place and also make sure that it's stable. They also work with the data center facilities team members to ensure the right power is supplied to the rack. And the power on activity and the hardware check, the basic hardware check, is actually performed by the hardware partner. These are some of the real pictures that I have been able to capture from one of the recent deployments that we did. The first picture that you're seeing is the Azure Stack 4-node fully integrated rack. In the second picture that you're seeing is actually the back side of the rack. As you can see, everything is neatly cabled and racked. So this actually happens in the Dell factory. So by the way, this is the Dell EMC rack option. If the customer were to choose the customer rack option, then it will be delivered in a mini rack, and a separate activity needs to happen where the hardware from the mini rack is actually moved and racked and cabled into the customer rack. The third picture that you're seeing is actually the front view of the rack. This is a 2U-R740 XTs. As you can see, there are 4 servers. So completing the deployment workbook is an important activity. So as you can recall, we discussed about what are the typical data gathering that happens during the customer data gathering phase. All that data which is being gathered also goes into the deployment workbook, right? So a deployment workbook is ideally given by the project manager to the customer, and customer is actually responsible to ensure that all the inputs to the deployment workbook has been provided. So obviously the hardware partner works very closely with the customer to ensure the deployment workbook is complete. Okay, so we're in the final phase of the deployment, which is the deployment of the Azure Stack integrated system itself. Now, before we get into the various activities during the deployment of the Azure Stack, let's quickly look at the Azure Stack architecture from a very, very high level. The Azure Stack is built on a hyper-converged infrastructure platform, which is software defined. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go into the details of what is hyper-converged and what is software defined, but hyper-converged is nothing but software manages the compute, storage, and the network aspects of the physical hardware. So if you look at the physical components that actually go into the Azure Stack integrated rack, one of the key components is the hardware lifecycle host. Now, hardware lifecycle host is also popularly known as HLH. serves two purposes. One, it acts as a staging server during the deployment of the Azure Stack. Two, it hosts the management VMs, which is used for monitoring and lifecycle management of the Azure Stack. Now, all the scale units, including the HLH, are connected in a failover mode to two top-of-rack switches, which are again configured in a failover mode. Both the top-of-rack switches then connect to the customer border switches. There's one more switch which is used for the out-of-band monitoring of all the hardware, including the switches, the HLH, and the scale unit nodes. And lastly, the scale units node themselves, which hosts the Azure Stack software. Now, as part of the deployment activities, the field services team will do the initial power up of the PDUs and the system components. They will also validate the network cabling is intact, which was actually done in the factory. They also check the hardware health of the scale unit nodes, HLH, and the network switches, just to make sure everything looks green and healthy. In the HLH configuration, the deployment engineer copies the latest Azure Stack software bits to the HLH server. Now, the software bits will generally include the Azure Stack software itself, which is latest, and the deployment tools and the scripts that are required to initiate the Azure Stack deployment. So once they copy, they initiate the HLH configuration through automated script. So at Dell EMC, we completely automate the HLH configuration. Now, as part of the automation, what we do is we deploy the deployment virtual machine, which is also called a DVM, and automatically assign the out-of-band IP addresses to scale unit and HLH nodes, and automatically update the firmware of the switches, which includes the top-of-rack switches and the out-of-band switch, and deploy the management VMs, which are required to do the lifecycle management of the Azure Stack and also monitor the Azure Stack. And finally, we prepare the HLH as a staging server. So once the staging server is prepared, the consulting team will take over depending on what the customer choices are. The customer may have opted for remote deployment of the Azure Stack, or they may prefer the on-site deployment of Azure Stack. So when I say Azure Stack, it's the Azure Stack software itself. So the consulting team then initiates the script to install the Azure Stack software on the scale unit nodes. Once the deployment is complete, they hand off to the customer in a working condition just to make sure that everything works, and also do a knowledge transfer in terms of how do you manage, monitor, lifecycle manage the Azure Stack integrated system. So for more information, if you want, you can actually refer to the link shown below, which is a Microsoft documentation which talks about the various aspects of the Azure Stack deployment. All right, so let's do a quick summary of what we learned and discussed so far. We discussed about the various deployment phases. We discussed about the deployment prerequisites. We went through the deal qualification questionnaire. We learned how to do a capacity planning using the capacity planner, the right identity provider. We discussed about various licensing models, the monitoring aspects, and also the backup and DR. And during the data gathering phase, we spoke about working sessions with the customer on network, facilities, the Azure Stack software, and how do you work through the deployment worksheet and so on. And during the delivery phase, we spoke about the power requirements, the cooling requirements, and also the hardware inspection that is carried out by the hardware partner. And during the deployment, we spoke about the initial hardware bring up, the HLH configuration, and the Azure Stack deployment, which is done either remotely or on-site by the consulting team. So with that, I have come to the end of this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to tweet me or shoot me an email or send me a message on LinkedIn. I hope you really enjoyed this session. Thanks again, and thank you for watching.